Profesor Abhijit Banerjee, con quien vamos a hablar sobre crecimiento y sobre todo reducción de pobreza. Dr. Banerjee, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Is this your first time in Lima?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
hopefully
there's
not the last.
a broad range of scholars working with us right now in this new form of looking and fighting on poverty, which is micro solutions. Please tell us a little bit about this difference between macro solutions and micro solutions.
So I think part of this is illusory. So every macro solution is a set of micro solutions. In the end, sometimes we don't know what's happening. We call it macro because, you know, the country grew, but in fact the country grew because some things were done right or some accident happened or some those piece of luck, and then that translates drop by drop into different things, and so eventually most things that happen have a micro causality. It's just sometimes we don't know what it is, so we call it macro, and sometimes we actually identify the source and then we call it micro. I think this is mostly in the eyes of the beholder.
World poverty rates weren't reducing with growth economics up until the late 70s. But starting 1980, there was a very huge drop on poverty rates around the world. Can you explain us a little bit how and why this happened?
So two things happened. One is that I think China happened. And that's why China happened, I don't think anybody knows. So let me not try to answer a question that I think is pure speculation. Why China did as well as it did, I don't think anybody knows even an approximate answer. I mean, you could make up answers, but I don't think anybody would swear by the fact that if they had been asked that same question in 1980, they would have all said, you know, of course China is now going to grow. I think if you read people writing about China in 1980 or 85, I think they were much less optimistic than what happened. So, but the other part of it is, I think one funny thing about the measurement of poverty is that, you know, countries have poverty lines, and poverty lines seem to be very sticky. They don't change very much. So as countries get richer, people get closer to the poverty line, but nothing changes because they're still below the poverty line. And then they get a little bit richer, and a lot of people move across the poverty line. That's what happened in, for example, in India. Big change in poverty happened not because the poor got a lot richer, but because they got a little bit richer, and they crossed the poverty line. The poverty line was kind of fixed; it didn't really move. People were kind of moving up, and then they crossed. And then a whole bunch of people crossed, and you saw a big reduction in poverty. That's part of an artifact of the fact that we have a poverty line. The line is kind of a line I drew in the sand. It doesn't really mean very much.
Actually, the Ravallon and Chen, two scholars from the World Bank, have been discussing about the poverty lines, now set at $1.25 for extreme poverty and $2.50 for poverty. What's your view on these poverty lines? Do you think they are accurate in measuring poverty around the world?
I don't think that's not an answerable question in my view. I mean, it's completely ad hoc to say that, you know, somebody who's a little bit poorer than somebody else is really poor and somebody else is not poor. It's a social judgment. So, you know, it may be a social judgment, it could even be a personal judgment. I might feel I'm poor even if I'm not. And so it's never going to be a one philosophical break that's going to say, you know, exactly at 1.25 you are not poor. You can't. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to kind of reconcile approaches taken in many countries and try to see if we can come up with something that's more or less not too different from what different countries do, so that it looks like we are not setting a standard that's not that's entirely internationally driven. So the challenge is more political, which is, imagine that I set a standard at $10 a day, then most countries will scream and say, look, you made up this standard. People at $5 a day don't think they are poor in Bangladesh. Well, who are you to tell us that no, they are poor? So I think it's more a political challenge that they're dealing with how to come up with a number that's kind of global without being irrelevant, being so low that nobody thinks it's relevant, or so high that everybody thinks it's irrelevant. So you want a balance there, and that's all they're trying to do. They're trying to solve a political problem. They're not really solving a kind of a philosophical or physiological problem. It's just sort of political balancing thing.
Maybe one evidence of that is the spectrum of different poverty lines. When you have Luxembourg with $45 per day as a poverty line, it maybe is a perfect evidence of what you're saying. I would like to ask you about a different aspect of poverty alleviation or reduction, which is growth. Are there still any doubts about a relationship between economic growth and poverty reduction? Because in Latin America, there's still some fighting over this. There are still a lot of people that doubt that economic growth really helps the poor.
So I don't think the question is whether or not economic growth helps the poor, but whether or not it helps it to the extent that we should ignore all other concerns. So I think the political conversation there is between people who say, look, let's create anything that is pro-growth, let's do it, and then we'll maximize growth, and therefore we'll maximize poverty reduction. And people who say that something might increase growth by a very little bit, but might have massive poverty increase consequences, and we should be careful. So I don't think anybody is saying that if GDP went up by 100%, poverty won't be reduced. I don't think anybody is saying that. I mean, nobody in their right mind is saying that. People sometimes say all kinds of things, but they're often posturing. I don't think anybody in right mind is actually saying it. I think what they're saying is, look, here is this mine. Maybe this mine will increase GDP by 0.01%, but will create 40,000 more poor people. What's the trade-off there? I think that's the issue, is whether it's always better to choose something that increases GDP, or is it the case that you should sometimes recognize that this might increase GDP, but it increases huge amount of misery somewhere. And I think that's where I think most sensible people could disagree on exactly where to draw the trade-off between those things, but it's not the case that that trade-off is meaningless. It's a reasonable question to ask.
When one looks at the scholars' articles and journals, there's still a great debate on what are the best growth strategies. So I guess there's no consensus in that part, but what are your best strategies for growth?
I have always said that we don't know. This is one of the areas we know the least. We know how to destroy growth. I think North Korea knows how to destroy growth. We know if you completely shut down all private enterprise, you make it impossible for people to do anything. If you start a civil war, you can stop growth. The opposite, I think you look around the world, there are lots of countries who are doing the quote-unquote the right things, and nothing's happening. Take Peru. I mean, why Peru was not growing for the last some years, and why is it growing now?
Actually, Peru, we feel like a natural experiment, because we had some very strict type of policies up until 1990, and in 1990 we started a process of reforms that made growth start seem like a reality, and that type of reforms bring us in the 2000s, 2003, after the recession of 2001, with very high growth numbers, even 10% a year, and very high reductions of poverty. We came from 54% to 25% in almost 11, 12 years. So now we're into some type of challenge against us of how can we grow faster, and we have people that are starting to say that we could grow much higher than 6%, as if 6% were not enough. And if something is clashing against the growth rate, you have big headlines on the newspapers and so forth. Exactly how can you explain to us what would be a normal growth rate if there would be something like that?
But let me going back to what you said, a little bit breaking up. I think Peru is, you put it, I think of it as being a, you said it's a natural experiment.
We feel like it.
I feel a little bit like it's also a good example of, you as I said, there are things you can do to make growth impossible. Peru had those till the 80s, let's say. At some point it removed a lot of it. Then it took another about 15 years for growth to really start. Why didn't it start in 15 years before that? Why did, growth went up slowly and then accelerated? Why did it grow up slowly and then accelerated, or accelerate and then slow down? I don't think we have a very good handle on this question. So that's to say that I think we should do the right things because they're the right things. People should go to school, improve education, improve the infrastructure, roads, do the right thing, and then whether that will increase growth tomorrow or in 10 years, we don't know. We have very little, the connection between the instrument and the outcome is very weak. We kind of know that. We know that, so, you can pretend that there's a strong causal relationship, but to be honest, if you look closely, the relationship is always relatively weak. And that's maybe partly that's a matter of timing. We don't actually know how these things operate. Maybe the roads need to be around for a while before people start starting businesses, and then that generates jobs, and that generates demand, and then the economy grows. But this kind of thing makes me feel that, once I'm talking about equilibriums of large systems, we don't really know very much to calibrate it finely. So that's why I think to anybody who says that it's 6% now, let's do something, let's change everything, my view is, hold on. You check whether you're doing the fundamentals right. There are clearly things you can do to screw it up. Like if your workforce is not educated, that's going to eventually come back to haunt you. If it is the case that your infrastructure is really bad, it will come back to haunt you. Do I know something that you could do that's really going to, is it worth sacrificing every other objective to increase growth today by 0.5%? Can you guarantee it will happen? Is it worth it? That's a much harder question, and I feel like you can get obsessed by the growth rate, because I don't think we have that much control over it. So you might have an illusion of control. Oh yeah, this regulation is true, but sometimes regulations have a purpose, and it's worth keeping a view of what are good things, kind of without thinking that they're going to all feed into growth tomorrow.
Great. Bien, vamos a hacer una primera pausa, regresamos.